welcome to the first and last podcast of Blah Blah Blah.
My name's Izzy.
And I'm Christina. And today we're going to talk about literary criticism because you already know how much people love that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically Marxist criticism.
My favorite.
And new historicism and cultural materialism.
Yes, and we'll be using these two forms of criticism to discuss two great short stories. The first is Apollo by Chimamanda Adichi, and Caille Millner's The Politics of the Quotidian.
Why don't you tell us more about these stories for those who don't know what they are about?
Apollo begins with Okenwa, the protagonist, as a grown-up visiting his parents, who in old age have changed their mindset from being scholarly to believing in superstitions. They recount back to an old houseboy named Raphael who ended up being a ringleader in an armed robbery. Okenwa reminisces about the intimate friendship he once had with Raphael, watching old kung fu movies, practicing fight moves, and sharing Apollo, which is basically pink eye. This all ended when Okenwa fell by himself, but blamed Raphael out of jealousy, sending him out of his job as a houseboy.
Yep, that sounds about right.
Alright, but what about the politics of the quotidian?
Oh right, how could I even forget about that? Basically, it follows an unnamed female narrator who we learn is a minority. In this story, the narrator is a grad student who teaches philosophy. She has several encounters which diminish her stance as a female educator.
Do you know anything about the authors themselves, though?
I sure do. Let me tell you all about them because they're pretty interesting. First, I would like to introduce Chimamanda Adichi, who was born in Enugu, Nigeria, and both her parents worked at the local university. She also takes part in a lot of advancements in equality for both women and class. There's actually a piece where she talks all about this, but let me play it for you.
Example, and just that idea that it's so important to just remember that we are, all equally human and that we are all equally deserving of dignity.
You know, now that I know where she comes from, it's pretty clear that she's writing about something that she's intimately familiar with. It kind of reminds me of Marxist ideals.
Oh really? Why don't you tell me more about Marxism?
Yeah, Marxism is all about living in a classless society that's based on materialism, and it presents the idea of class conflict for economic and social gain. One thing that Marxist criticism deals with is this idea that a writer's background heavily influences what they write about, and that is absolutely true in both of these stories.
Now that you say that, it really does make a lot of sense. I can totally see that in The Politics of the Quotidian, because Millner might have faced the same challenges since the narrator in her story and herself were both grad students at some point. Since there is no clear narrator listed, we can take it that it's her speaking from true experiences. Maybe not exactly, but something of the sorts.
Exactly. You mentioned earlier that Adichi was born in Enugu, Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Adichi came from an upper-class family, and it's easy to see how that influenced her story. Because pretty early on, the bottom of the first page to be exact, we learn that Okenwa's parents are both professors when it says, quote, my mother, a professor of political science, quote, and on the next page it says, quote, my father, a professor of education, unquote.
Yeah, you also mentioned that Marxism has to do a lot with class struggle. And when I first read Apollo, it seemed clear to me that there was an issue about class and culture.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because both stories deal with a social hierarchy, which definitely goes against Marxist ideals. In Apollo, Okenwa was relatively high class. We learned that they have a house help on the second page when his mother says, quote, he was our houseboy years ago, unquote. So right off the bat, we know that there's a significant difference in social class between the main characters.
Damn, I noticed that there were classes, but I didn't think of it that much. But it makes a lot of sense, because at the end of Apollo, we see Okenwa finally showing his dominance over Raphael when he purposely falls and blames it on him. Their friendship challenges the whole dynamic of the different classes, but it doesn't make them obsolete. Ultimately, the reason why Raphael is so easily dismissed and set on the path of crime is because of their class differences. I think that I also saw that on NewYorker.com, William Davidson states how he doesn't, quote, think Okenwa being drawn to Raphael is a conscious class rebellion, unquote, in his article, This Week in Fiction, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I think this is true in some parts, but Okenwa ultimately shows his clear social stance near the end when he begins to order Raphael around when he doesn't get his way.
Exactly.
But couldn't you say that the narrator in The Politics of the Quotidian also follows some Marxist critiques?
I never really thought of that, but how so?
Well, first off, she's already looked down upon, like how Raphael was when she stated that her major was philosophy. She received, quote, the same look, pity, unquote, from the, quote, triptych of white beards, deep voices, and cashmere sport coats, unquote. Already, from the beginning of the story, we can already see the societal space that she lives in due to her being of a non-favorable major.
I think that's funny because shortly after it states that, quote, the university wanted to make classrooms feel less hierarchical, unquote, but instead it does the complete opposite.
Hmm.
One other aspect of Marxist criticism that I think this story addresses is the dialectic aspect, which has to do with the clashing of opposing ideas that results in the introduction of new ideas. And I think this happens when her student yells out, quote, you don't know what you're talking about, unquote.
Dude, I would legitly beat that kid.
I know what you mean, but I think this is a dialectic because it makes her doubt herself, something she hadn't done before. So you see how this clash of ideas between the protagonist and the student resulted in the creation of an entirely new idea. This Marxist criticism is pretty interesting stuff.
It really is, but I think there's more to these stories than just Marxism.
What do you mean?
Even though you had some good points, I saw that there were some cultural and historical parts of Apollo and the politics of the Quotidian that could make them all the more compelling.
Alright, well, elaborate.
Alright, well, first let me tell you about what New Historicism and Cultural Materialism is. So in New Historicism, it's the parallel reading of literary and non-literary texts, usually of the same historical period. This concerns the configurations of power, society, or ideology in a given time. In this case, both literary and historical words hold equal weight. So it's kind of like juxtaposing two texts to get the full meaning of the story. As stated in owenglishpurdue.edu, New Historicism, quote, assumes that every work is a product of the historic moment that created it, unquote. On the other hand, cultural materialism is said to be, quote, the study of historical material within a politicized framework that includes those literary texts that help to shape the story, unquote.
So that, in a way, relates to Marxism, doesn't it?
It kind of does, actually, since it deals with social and political relevance. But in New Historicism, it focused more on the history and objective truth.
Oh, I get it. But how does that relate to the stories?
Honestly, New Historicism can be related to anything that has culture and history, like anything. Apollo was written in 2015, so we can assume that anyone with a houseboy is from a wealthy family, because what poor family has a servant, you know? However, we need to take into account the culture of Nigeria. In Nigeria during this time, we didn't have to be one of the 2% of the higher class to own such help. It was a common thing for lower middle class to have them around.
So you don't even have to be rich to have that kind of help?
Nope, not at all. Isn't that crazy?
That's pretty crazy.
So Nigeria isn't as impoverished as everyone is led to believe, like in this one video.
Nigeria is a country with a vast amount of contradiction and complexity. It has giant megacities and small rural tribes. It's a land of self-reliance and entrepreneurial spirit, aching to reap the benefits of a modern world, but it's also riddled with inequality, unemployment, and terror groups looking to reverse that progress.
Wow, okay. That's pretty interesting.
Right? We believe it to be an impoverished country with no source of resources or comfortability. So in this story, we're kind of shocked when we find out that the parents are wealthy professors and that they're able to afford Raphael to help around the house. Immediately, we think that this family is wealthy, but in reality, they're kind of somewhere in the middle. It connects to the culture as text, but the representation of this life seemed different than what we believed it to be. It basically critiques the way Americans are to think of Nigeria because it shows how little we know of their life. So it really puts the story in perspective of our life today.
I can see how it works. I mean, materialism is also an important factor since everything we do is based on the things that we have. Like in Apollo, Okenwa, quote, looked around Raphael's room and was struck by how bare it was, unquote. This clearly shows how his lack of material items dictates where he is in the social ladder.
Yeah, I can totally agree with that, since Raphael was their houseboy, since Okenwa's family did own him. Since he was of their possession, it caused the family to have, quote, about them the air of people who are quick to dismiss others, unquote, while his mother, quote, shouted at them for being slow, stupid, and hard of hearing, unquote. This really shows how they are as people, and I definitely would not want them as, like, an owner or anything.
That's a good point because in the politics of the Quotidian, the narrator has a degree in philosophy, but she's still looked down upon because she's a female and a minority. On Blogspot.com, it talks about Millner's contributor's note, which states that the narrator is, quote, a person of color who's failing to make her way in a historically homogenous institution, unquote, which I think perfectly echoes the difficulties that women in the workplace face in our society today.
Right? But just to explain a little bit if you didn't really know, quotidian is the ordinary or everyday things that happen in life. The life that the narrator went through is considered a normal day for a woman. Even though her race wasn't clearly identified, we assume that she's of a minority because she has darker skin. The fact that the title, headed by politics, implies that this life as ordinary is very controversial. No woman should deal with such a life of discrimination. This ties into Marxism since it relates to the classes, because in a way, she is social climbing to be equal as the rest, especially to the men. She wants to be respected as a teacher, as an individual, and as a woman.
You know, using these literary criticism devices was actually a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, like I just thought these stories were just for fun, but after analyzing them using these techniques, I have more appreciation for them.
Alright, that's all the time we have. Thanks for listening to Blah Blah Blah.
Your fix of literary banter.